Welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Today, we're going way back in time, over 1,000 years. We're going to be exploring the world of a German bishop named Dithmar. And he wrote a chronicle called the Chronicon. And you wouldn't believe some of the stories he tucked in there. Talk about medieval mysteries.
Yeah, what's so fascinating is that Dithmar, he wasn't trying to write like a book of ghost stories.
Right.
He was recording history as he saw it, battles, politics, kind of the major events of his time, but kind of woven into these accounts are these incredible moments where the supernatural seems to kind of break through.
It really makes you think. What did people back then make of these strange occurrences? Especially for someone like Dithmar, a man of deep faith.
Well, for Dithmar and his contemporaries, the line between the earthly and the spiritual wasn't quite as solid as it might seem to us today,
Right.
These stories weren't just entertainment, they were woven into the fabric of their understanding of the world, their faith, even their fears.
Okay, I'm definitely intrigued. So let's dive into one of these stories. What's a good one to start with?
Let's talk about Gero, a nobleman who fell deathly ill in the year 970. For 3 days, everyone believed him to be dead.
Okay, so far so historical. Where's the spooky part?
Well, as was the custom, Gero was being carefully guarded after his apparent death. But then a servant girl claimed to have seen him vanish right before her eyes.
Vanish, like into thin air.
Exactly. Terrified, she ran to tell the archbishop. And from there, the story takes even more twists and turns.
I can only imagine. Now, how did Dithmar, as a bishop, how did he interpret such a bizarre event?
Well, for Dithmar, it was a clear sign of divine intervention, a powerful reminder of God's control over life and death. Remember, this was a time when faith was deeply embedded in every aspect of life.
So it's not just a ghost story, it's a story about the power of God.
Precisely. And for those listening who share Dithmar's Catholic faith, this story might prompt them to reflect on their own understanding of the afterlife and the mystery of the soul's journey after death. Think about it. What do you make of this tale of sudden disappearance and the archbishop's involvement? Is it a simple ghost story? Or is there a deeper meaning here?
It's fascinating how these stories, even though they're from so long ago, can still make us think about our own beliefs.
Absolutely, and that's what makes exploring these historical accounts so intriguing. Now, are you ready for another story? This one involves a vision, experienced by Bishop Bernward while he was ill.
A vision. Okay, this sounds interesting. Was it like a prophetic dream or something?
In a way, yes. Bernward saw his pastoral staff slip from his grasp and be picked up by his chaplain Bernhard.
A very specific vision.
And what did Dithmar make of it?
Well, Dithmar interpreted this vision as a foreshadowing of Bernhard succeeding Bernward as bishop, which is exactly what happened later on. So a prophecy fulfilled. I wonder if people back then saw these kinds of visions as messages from God, guiding their decisions.
It's certainly possible. For them, the spiritual world wasn't some distant abstract concept. It was intertwined with their everyday lives, sometimes offering glimpses of the future or warnings of things to come.
It's a completely different way of looking at the world than most of us have today. But there's something compelling about it, don't you think?
I agree. It challenges us to consider the possibility of a greater plan at work, even in the seemingly random events of our lives.
Okay, so we've had a vanishing nobleman and a prophetic vision. What other kinds of stories did Dithmar record?
Well, this next one takes a bit of a darker turn. It involves a nobleman named Thietmar. And let's just say his actions had some pretty unsettling consequences.
Uh-oh, this sounds a bit ominous. What did Thietmar do?
Dithmar tells us that on Christmas Day, Thietmar forced his wife to swear a false oath.
Whoa, hold on. That's a serious offense, especially for someone as devout as Dithmar seems to have been.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a social faux pas. Remember, in those days, oaths were considered sacred, carrying spiritual weight. Breaking an oath was like breaking a covenant with God.
So what happened after Thietmar made his wife commit this terrible act?
Shortly after, his wife gave birth to a child with a severe deformity. And Dithmar saw this as a direct consequence of Thietmar's actions, a manifestation of God's wrath.
That's a pretty stark interpretation. It really highlights how seriously people took oaths and vows back then, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It wasn't just about legal agreements, it was about maintaining right relationship with God and the spiritual order of things.
It's interesting how these stories offered a glimpse into the moral landscape of that time. What would you say, as a Catholic, is the most important takeaway from this particular story?
For me, it emphasizes the gravity of oaths and vows, especially those made before God. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences, not just in this life, but potentially in the eyes of God as well. What do you think about that? Does it resonate with your own understanding of faith and morality?
It definitely makes me think about the weight of the promises we make, both to others and to ourselves. But we've covered a lot of ground already. Maybe it's time to take a little break and let these stories sink in.
Good idea. We'll be back soon with more fascinating tales from Dithmar's Chronicon.
Welcome back to our deep dive into Dithmar's Chronicon. We've already heard some incredible stories, but, there are more eerie encounters kind of waiting for us.
Yes. And this next one dials up the intensity a bit. It involves a priest and a rather unwelcome visitor in the year 1001.
Ooh, I'm all ears. Who was this visitor?
Dithmar describes it as an encounter with the devil himself.
Whoa, the devil, that's taking things to a whole other level. What happened?
Okay, so according to Dithmar, this demonic figure appeared before the priest, tempting him with promises of worldly power and riches.
Classic temptation. Wealth and influence. It's a tale as old as time. How did the priest react?
He stood firm in his faith. Dithmar writes that the priest, through prayer and the sign of the cross, was able to drive this demonic presence away.
Wow, a powerful example of resisting temptation. It must have been terrifying, yet he didn't waver. It really speaks to the power of faith.
It does, and it reinforces the belief that while evil forces might be present in the world, faith and prayer can be potent weapons against them.
It's a reminder that even in darkness, we can find strength in our faith. Okay, ready for another tale from Dithmar's Chronicle.
Always. And this one is less about demonic encounters and more about a mysterious event surrounding the death of Archbishop Gisler of Magdeburg in 1004.
Intriguing. Tell me more.
So Gisler's death itself wasn't unusual, but what happened afterwards was quite strange. His body was being transported from Magdeburg to his burial site in the town of Lietzgau.
Okay, that sounds like quite a journey. Any particular reason for the specific burial location?
Gisler had a deep connection to Lietzgau. It was where he founded a monastery.
Ah, I see. So what happened during this journey?
As the funeral procession was crossing the Elbe River, something incredible happened. According to Dithmar, Gisler's coffin suddenly became incredibly light, almost weightless.
Wait, weightless? How did people explain that?
Dithmar saw it as a clear sign of divine intervention. He believed it symbolized Gisler's soul being lifted to heaven, freed from earthly burdens.
Wow. That's a beautiful interpretation. It speaks to the hope and promise of eternal life, doesn't it?
It does. It's a reminder that death, while a part of life, isn't the end of the story. Especially for those of the Catholic faith, it could spark reflections on the lives of saints and the miracles attributed to them. It highlights that even in death, divine grace can manifest.
Yeah. It's comforting to think about the possibility of miracles, even in death. But I'm curious, did all of Dithmar's stories have these clear-cut, faith-based interpretations?
Not always. Some were more ambiguous, leaving room for different interpretations. In fact, the next story we'll discuss is a prime example of that. It involves a man accused of stealing sacred relics from a church.
Stealing relics? That sounds like a serious crime back then. What happened to him?
He was caught and sentenced to a rather gruesome punishment, being broken on a wheel.
Oh, wow. That's brutal. It makes you realize how differently justice was handled back then.
It does. But here's where things take an unexpected turn. Sometime later, when the man's body was found, Dithmar noted that it showed no signs of decay.
No decay. That's incredible. What did Dithmar make of that?
Even Dithmar, a man of deep faith, struggled to explain it. He acknowledged that there might be forces at play beyond human understanding, possibly hinting at divine grace. But it remained a mystery.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What do you think, as a Catholic, this story might reveal about the nature of God's mercy?
That's a great question. Perhaps it suggests that God's mercy can extend beyond the boundaries of our understanding, even to those who have committed grave sins. It's a concept that's central to the Catholic faith, the idea of redemption and forgiveness, even in the face of transgression.
Yeah, it's a powerful thought. But, as we delve into these stories, I can't help but notice how central the church was to people's lives back then.
Absolutely. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was the center of community life, a source of moral guidance, and a powerful force in shaping people's understanding of the world.
And these stories, in a way, reflect that. They're not just about ghosts and the supernatural. They're about how faith shaped every aspect of their lives.
Exactly. Dithmar's Chronicon offers a glimpse into a world where faith wasn't just a belief system, but a lens through which people viewed everything, from daily events to matters of life and death.
It's a fascinating perspective, and one that I think we can still learn from today.
Right.
But we have one more story from Dithmar's Chronicle to discuss. Are you ready for it?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm definitely ready. For our final story from Dithmar's Chronicle, what do you have for us? Okay, so this one's a bit different. It doesn't involve like ghosts or visions, but it raises questions about power, about justice, even the limits of human understanding. It involves a group of men who were accused of a very serious crime, arson.
Arson. That sounds dangerous. What happened?
Well, according to Dithmar, these men were accused of setting fire to a church, which, as you can imagine, was a hugely significant act in those days.
Absolutely. I mean, the church wasn't just a building. It represented the heart of the community and the presence of God. Burning it down would have been seen as a direct attack on both.
Exactly. And so the punishment for these men was incredibly severe. They were condemned to death by burning.
Burning at the stake. That's intense. What was Dithmar's perspective on this punishment?
Well, Dithmar doesn't explicitly condemn or condone the act. He simply records it as a historical event, which in itself tells us something about the time period. Justice was often harsh and swift, and the church played a significant role in both legal and spiritual matters.
Yeah, it's a stark reminder of how different life was back then. But it also makes me wonder, did Dithmar see this as a form of divine justice? Were these men's actions seen as not only a crime against society, but also a sin against God?
That's a great question. While Dithmar doesn't explicitly say, it's certainly possible that this act of arson was viewed through a spiritual lens. Remember, fire held immense symbolic power in medieval society, both as a destructive force and as a purifying element.
So burning these men alive could have been seen as a way of cleansing them of their sin.
Potentially, yes. Or at least it could have been seen as a way of protecting the community from the spiritual taint of their actions.
It's a sobering thought. But it also highlights how intertwined faith, justice, and social order were in Dithmar's world.
Absolutely. These weren't separate spheres. They were all part of a single, cohesive worldview.
It's fascinating to think about how different that worldview is from our own today. But as we've been discussing, there are also some striking similarities.
Oh, what do you mean?
Well, even though we might not think about it consciously, we all have a worldview, a set of beliefs and assumptions that shape how we interpret the world around us. And for many people, especially those of faith, those beliefs include ideas about the supernatural, the afterlife, and the nature of good and evil.
That's a great point. Dithmar's Chronicle might seem like a window into a distant past, but it also holds up a mirror to our own beliefs and values.
Exactly. And that's why I think it's so important to engage with these stories, even though they're from, over 1,000 years ago. They challenge us to think critically about our own assumptions and to consider the different ways that people have understood the world throughout history.
I couldn't agree more. And as we wrap up our deep dive into Dithmar's Chronicon, I want to leave our listeners with one final thought.
What's that?
Think about the stories we've discussed today. The vanishing nobleman, the prophetic vision, the deformed child, the demonic encounter, the weightless coffin, the undecayed body, and the men condemned to burn.
It's quite a collection.
It is. And each story, in its own way, speaks to the enduring human fascination with the mysterious, with the unexplained. We might have different explanations for these events today, but the questions they raise, they remain timeless.
So as you go about your day, keep those questions in mind. Look for the deeper meaning in the events of your life. And don't be afraid to embrace the mystery. Who knows what you might discover?
Well said. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those spooky stories coming.
Farewell.